When Israel's high council heard that Peter and the apostles were out of prison and back preaching in the temple about Jesus, they were furious and wanted to kill them on the spot. But one of the council members stood up, a Pharisee by the name of Gamaliel, a teacher of God's law who was honored by everyone. He ordered the men taken out of the room for a short time, then said, "Fellow Israelites, be careful what you do to these men. Not long ago, Theudas made something of a splash, claiming to be somebody, and got about 400 men to join him. He was killed, his followers dispersed, and nothing came of it. A little later, at the time of the census, Judas the Galilean appeared and acquired a following. He also fizzled out, and the people following him were scattered to the four winds. So I am telling you, hands off these men. Let them alone. If this program or this work is merely human, it will fall apart, but if it is of God, there is nothing you can do about it. And you better not be found fighting against God." That convinced them. They called the apostles back in. After giving them a thorough whipping, they warned them not to speak in Jesus' name and sent them out.
Maybe you will remember some time ago when I explained the significance of the pulpit. There's a reason why I usually do not stand in the pulpit to preach, because my intention is that we come together as a community. I am presenting something that I want us to consider. We are talking together. The pulpit symbolizes the authority of the clergy, and today I am speaking as an authority. Argue if you dare. So if you pick up the story at the right beginning and end in the right spot, the story sounds like a classic fairy tale. It has the flow of a classic fairy tale. There's this guy wandering in the desert. He has sheep. He looks across the way. He sees a bush on fire. The bush doesn't burn up. He goes over to check it out. As he approaches, the voice, "Moses, stop. Take off your shoes. The ground you're standing on is holy ground." Moses takes off his shoes. God says, "Moses, I have a mission impossible for you." Only unlike in the TV series, it was if you should choose to accept. There's no if you should choose to accept. God says, "I've got a job for you. It is daunting beyond all imagination. I need you to go to Egypt and rescue my people from the Egyptians." Now remember, all you know is what we're showing in this movie as it flows. We begin, we're dealing with a shepherd. He's an old guy. He has on shepherd's clothing. We haven't heard him talk yet. "Moses, I need you to go to Egypt and rescue my people." And Moses goes, "Excuse me, you've got the wrong person. That's not me." And so Moses and God have this back and forth at the bush. Moses protesting he can't do this, and God raising, he steps it up. Moses says, "Look, when I get down there, they're going to ask me, 'Who sent you?' God, I mean no disrespect. I don't even know your name. You're the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but that's not going to pass. They're going to want to know who you are." God says, "Okay, here's my name." Gives them the name. Moses still isn't buying. "They're not going to believe me." God says, "Look, I'll give you some magic tricks, 3 magic tricks. When you do these, they'll believe you." Moses is going, "Look, I don't talk well. I stumble over my words. I'm not fluent. This is a job for a public person. I'm a shepherd. God gets mad at this point and says, look, who made your mouth? I did. I can give you the ability to speak. And Moses goes, wait a minute, you don't know how difficult it is for me to speak. God says, all right, I'll send Aaron. You talk to Aaron, Aaron will talk for you. So Moses reluctantly goes back home to his father-in-law. He says, Dad, I need to go see my family in Egypt. I don't even know if they're still alive. Dad says, sure, go. Moses goes to Egypt. And most of you know the story. He gets down there. He has to use all of his magic tricks. And finally, people are starting to pay attention. But the Egyptians naturally do not let the Jewish people go. So then he has to pull out the big guns, and there's these 10 plagues. Yeah, it'd be like having 9.0 earthquakes in LA and San Francisco, and Mount Rainier exploding, and about 70 tornadoes across the Midwest, and Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Katrina on the East Coast, and flooding on the Mississippi and the Missouri, and a pandemic. I mean, life is terrible in Egypt. And Pharaoh is finally persuaded that Moses has the on-off switch for these disasters, and he says, take your people, go, go. And they march out of Egypt loaded with booty. When you tell the story this way, this is a classic fairy tale. Big problem, unlikely hero, magic, and they live happily ever after. But if you read the whole story, you discover that this is real life. When God wanted somebody to take a bunch of slaves and turn them into a nation who would be guardians of a preeminent moral vision in the world, that's an incredible leap, and magic won't get you there. God reached down and he tapped the sole Jewish person who had a PhD or 2 or 3. Because you know the story, or at least most of you do. Moses, of course, was born as a slave child in a slave family, but through an incredible turn of events, he's raised as an adopted child in the household of Pharaoh. He is given all of the advantages that the education system of Egypt can give. He grows up with all the cultural advantages that you pick up by osmosis living in the world that Moses lived in. Yeah, God picked a shepherd, but the shepherd was a king in disguise, fully qualified. And God picked Moses. And Moses led the people out of Egypt and then spent the next 40 years in the most difficult, impossible job you can imagine, trying to mold a bunch of rescued slaves into a civilization. It did not go smoothly. And in 40 years, Moses lost his cool only once. That says something about his character. It also says something about his training. And then God chose to reveal all these laws through Moses, laws that are easily the equal of any of the legal codes that were extant at the time. It was the fruit of his education. And some of you might be thinking of classic Christian tellings of God's activity. You know, God, you've heard this, God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. It's a cute saying, but it's actually not true. The normal pattern is that God calls the qualified. God looked around the Middle East and he found the person with the highest degree of culture and education he could find. And he put that person in charge of forming the constitution, if you will, of Israel, which the rabbis and scholars and poets spent the next 1,000 years reflecting on, modifying, and growing from. Same thing in the New Testament. Jesus, of course, was not formally educated. He also did not write laws. He did not give us any detailed or balanced legislation. He, like an artist, Marguerite, thanks for being here. How impoverished the world is without art. But my guess is you probably don't want your airplanes built by artists. You probably don't want your laws written by artists. And you certainly don't want your books kept by artists, at least if other artists are like me. I love numbers. I can be very creative with them. Jesus did not write the New Testament, and he gave us no laws. The person in the New Testament that would be parallel to Moses is Paul. And again, somebody who in his culture had the equivalent of a PhD. Though I like the story that Daisy read for us, because actually there are two people with PhDs who are absolutely crucial to the life of the church. Most of us know about Paul, and we think about Paul, and he's famous for writing Romans and Galatians and all those books. But the church exists today because of the intervention of another person with a PhD. The church, after the resurrection of Jesus, I don't know, we're months away from the resurrection. Don't know how many. The church is still a group of believers in Jerusalem. And the leaders in Jerusalem are getting annoyed at the disruption being caused by these Christians. And they arrest all of the apostles, the entire 12. Put them in jail. An angel comes in the night, lets them all out, and says, go back to the temple and start preaching again. The next day, the police report this. And they go and invite the apostles to come in for an interview with the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. The apostles come. It's not a friendly interview. The right-wingers are so frustrated, they right then call for the execution of these guys. Let's just kill them off and be done with it. It was a PhD who stood up and saved the apostles. Now, he was a Pharisee, not exactly a flaming liberal in that society, but he was a deep, pious scholar, highly respected for his scholarship and his character. And so when he spoke, people listened. And he gave the speech that Daisy read for us. He said, look, you guys, if God is in this movement, you can't stop it. And if God isn't, let him take care of it. And so they let the apostles go. Many scholars, and I certainly don't call myself a scholar, but I agree with them, if the 12 apostles had been killed at that point, if they had removed the entire leadership group of the apostles, it would have devastated the church. It also would have set the tone in Jerusalem, which over the next few months, anyone who had dared publicly speak for Jesus would have been killed. The church would have never, you and I would have never heard about it. It would have never existed. The church was saved by a PhD, and then it was taken out of Jerusalem into the broader Mediterranean world by a PhD. We all know stories of people who do significant things with no education. And some of us might love the fact that Bill Gates didn't finish college. I think that's right. That wasn't in my notes. But when we look at Scripture, it is crystal clear that the strenuous prolonged effort of education is the kind of preparation that, at least on 3 massively important occasions, God looked for. And so, graduates, as a church, we say blessings on you. And students, especially Nate, I mean, you're 4 years farther from the end of wherever you're going than Emma is. Oh my. My own kids have sometimes gone, man, I don't want to spend the rest of my life in school. I understand that. But if you have a dream that God has planted in you, if your dreams line up with the dreams of God that we talked about last week, dreams of a world where righteousness is at home, where people beat their swords into plowshares, where nations do not learn war anymore. If your dream is big enough, it's worth half a lifetime of education. And as a church, we honor and encourage you if that is the call of God on your life. Sure, not everyone is called to get a PhD. And there's lots of work to do in the world that if you had a PhD, you probably couldn't do that work. But this morning, on graduation Sabbath, we as a congregation are wanting to affirm as strongly as we can the value and dignity of the work you students put into pursuing your education, the work of the teachers and school administrators that goes into education, the work of families coming up with money or supervising homework. Yeah, I'm going to pat myself on the back. When my daughter graduated from Auburn Academy, I almost threw myself a party. I told people, finally I'm done with school. Oh, this is so wonderful. No more sitting at the table at midnight helping with homework. Of course, I was imagining school back in the days before the internet. In her senior year, this past year, I got a phone call, 11 o'clock my time. Wait a minute, that's 2 o'clock Michigan time. Dad, could you get online and look at page 23 and help me with problem 5? Education is the work of the entire community. Church, the family, the students, grandma and granddad. And today we celebrate its value. Beyond that, we celebrate its necessity. If we are going to be about the business that God has called us to, mending the world, it calls for education. Thank you, all of you, for your involvement in this grand enterprise, pursuing the wisdom and knowledge required to do God's work in His world.